In the little town of Mariner's Hollow, life moved at the kind of slow, steady pace that made strangers feel like neighbors by the second day. Tucked between rolling green hills and a quiet stretch of coastline, it wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a postcard, but if you lived there, you knew it had a heartbeat. And that heartbeat came not from the town hall or the mayor's office, but from a small, unassuming group of people who showed up every week without being asked. They weren't paid. They didn't wear badges or carry titles. Most of them had already retired from long careers. Some had taught school. Others had run family shops, fixed boats, or raised kids who'd long since moved away. But instead of spending their days watching TV or napping in rocking chairs, they rolled up their sleeves. Every Monday morning, rain or shine, you'd find them in the community garden behind the old library, pulling weeds, planting seedlings, or tying up tomato vines. On Saturdays, they'd gather at the beach with trash bags and gloves, picking up plastic bottles, fishing line, and whatever the tide had left behind. Come December, they strung lights along Main Street and baked dozens of pies for the holiday potluck. No one ever made a big deal out of it. There were no press releases, no award ceremonies. They just did it because someone had to and because it felt right. The town council met once a month in the same wood-paneled room where decisions about potholes and parking meters were made. Occasionally, someone from the group would attend to give a quick update. The garden's doing well, or we'll need extra chairs for the summer concert. The council members would nod politely, maybe say great job, and move on to the next item. It never occurred to them that these quiet efforts were the glue holding the town's spirit together. The volunteers never asked for much. A few bags of mulch, access to the storage shed, maybe a mention in the town newsletter. They didn't expect thanks. They'd been doing this long enough to know that real community work rarely comes with applause. What mattered was seeing kids running through the sprinklers at the park they'd helped restore, or watching elderly neighbors smile as they picked fresh kale from the garden plot. It was the kind of satisfaction that didn't need an audience. But over time, something began to shift, not in the volunteers, but in how they were seen. Or rather, how they weren't seen at all. Council meetings grew more focused on budgets, regulations, and complaints from louder voices. The quiet, consistent presence of the volunteer group started to fade from the agenda. Their requests, once handled with a handshake, now required forms, approvals, and waiting lists. It wasn't malice. It was just distance, the kind that grows when people assume someone else will always be there to pick up the slack. Still, the group kept going. They told themselves it was just bureaucracy, just the way things were now. They adjusted, compromised, and made do. When the town's only youth mentorship program lost its funding, they pooled their own money to keep it running. When the annual fall festival was nearly canceled due to lack of resources, they spent 3 weekends building booths from scrap wood and baking enough cookies to feed the whole town. No one noticed the extra hours, the sore backs, or the personal savings quietly drained. To everyone else, it just looked like another successful event, another thing that just happened. And that was the problem. Because when something good happens over and over, people start to believe it's automatic, like sunrise or tides. They forget there are hands behind it, hearts behind those hands. In Mariner's Hollow, the volunteers had become invisible, not because they hid, but because everyone had stopped looking. Yet they stayed. Not out of obligation, but because they loved their town too much to let it slip away. They believed deep down that their work mattered, even if no one said so. They believed the council would eventually see what they were holding up. They believed that one day someone would notice the weight they carried and offer to share it. But belief can only carry you so far. And sometimes the quietest people make the loudest statement, not by shouting, but by simply stepping back. For now, though, they kept showing up. The garden bloomed. The beach stayed clean. The kids still had a place to go after school. Life in Mariner's Hollow felt warm, steady, and whole. No one could see the cracks forming beneath the surface, not even the ones who'd spent years patching them. And that's how it stayed. Until the storm hit. It wasn't just any storm. It came in late February, roaring off the ocean with winds that snapped tree branches and sent shingles flying. Rain poured for 2 straight days, turning streets into rivers and flooding the basement of the community center. The very building where the volunteers stored tools, hosted meetings, and held their winter craft workshops. When the skies finally cleared, they found the roof leaking badly. the ceiling sagging in the main hall and boxes of donated books and art supplies ruined by water. This time, they knew they couldn't fix it alone. The damage was too big, the cost too high. So, for the first time in years, they went to the council with a real request: emergency funds to repair the roof before the spring festival, which brought in much-needed donations for local programs. They brought photos, estimates, even a simple plan for how the work could be done quickly and affordably. What they didn't expect was to be met with sighs, paperwork, and a comment that landed like a stone in still water. "If it's so important, maybe you should fundraise yourselves." That sentence, casual, almost offhand, carried more weight than anyone in that room realized. It wasn't just a refusal, it was a message. Your work isn't essential. It's optional. It's not our problem. And in that moment, something inside the group shifted. Not with anger, but with a quiet, heavy clarity. They looked at each other, not with words, but with understanding. They'd given years of their time, energy, and love. They'd asked for so little. And now, when they truly needed support, they were being told to go beg for it. So they made a decision, not in a dramatic meeting, not with speeches, but in the silent car rides home, in the late-night phone calls, in the shared look over coffee the next morning. They would stop, not as a threat, not to punish anyone, but because they finally understood. If their presence meant nothing, then their absence might be the only language the town would understand. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, the garden still needed watering, the beach still had trash, and the town still believed everything was fine. No one knew that the quietest people in Mariner's Hollow were about to teach the loudest lesson of all by simply walking away. After the storm passed and the town dried out, life in Mariner's Hollow seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Birds returned to the feeders, kids rode bikes down the street again, and the local diner started serving hot coffee to early risers like always. But beneath that calm surface, something had changed, especially for the group that had quietly held so much together for so long. They didn't make a scene. There was no angry letter pinned to the bulletin board, no heated speech at the next council meeting. Instead, they just stopped. One by one, they returned the keys to the storage shed. They canceled the garden workdays. They quietly told the parents of the kids in the after-school program that they wouldn't be meeting anymore. They even took down the handmade signs for the spring festival, "See you in May," and stored them away in a closet like tucking a memory into a drawer. At first, it felt strange, like waking up and realizing you've forgotten to do something you've done every day for years. One of them stood in their kitchen on a Monday morning, coffee in hand, and almost reached for their gardening gloves before stopping mid-motion. Another walked past the beach on their usual route and had to force themselves not to pick up a plastic bottle glinting in the sun. It wasn't easy. These habits were part of who they were, but they knew if they kept going, nothing would ever change. So they stayed still. They stayed quiet, and they waited. The town didn't notice right away. Why would it? For over a decade, things had just happened. The garden bloomed. The paths were clean. The holiday lights went up. No one had ever stopped to ask how. Now, with no one planting new seeds, the garden beds began to look tired. Weeds crept in between the rows of carrots and beans. A few tomato plants left untied slumped over in the rain. But most folks just walked by, thinking maybe it was too early in the season or that someone was taking a break. The council, meanwhile, assumed it was all temporary. "They'll come around," someone said during a meeting. They always do. There was a quiet confidence in that statement. Not arrogance exactly, but a deep-rooted belief that these people would never really leave. After all, they'd never asked for anything. They'd never complained. They'd always shown up, so surely this was just a pause, a moment of frustration. Nothing more, but weeks passed. Then a month. The spring festival date came and went with no music, no food stalls, no children laughing in the bounce house. The town square stayed empty. Some residents asked around, confused. Who's in charge of that? They'd wonder aloud. Others just shrugged. Guess they're not doing it this year. That's when the first real crack started to show. The youth chess club, which met every Thursday in the community center, quietly dissolved. Without the familiar faces to greet them, the kids stopped coming. A few tried to organize their own games on the benches outside the library, but without someone to bring the boards, keep score, or just sit with them and offer quiet encouragement. It fizzled out. Parents noticed their kids spending more time indoors on screens and felt a vague sense of loss they couldn't quite name. At the beach, trash began to pile up. Not mountains of it, just enough to make the place feel less cared for. A soda can here, a candy wrapper there. Seagulls picked at plastic bags caught in the dune grass. Tourists still came, but some left early, muttering about how it used to be nicer. Locals avoided the shoreline not out of anger, but because it felt sad to see it neglected. Even small things started to unravel. The little free library box on Elm Street, once regularly stocked with books and wiped clean every week, gathered dust and rainwater. The bird feeders in the park ran empty. No one remembered to refill them, and still the council didn't connect the dots. They were busy with bigger issues, or what they thought were bigger issues. A debate over parking meters downtown, a proposal to repaint the crosswalks, budget reviews that stretched for hours. When someone finally mentioned the missing festival during a meeting, the response was practical, not personal. Well, if no one volunteers, we can't force them. Maybe we cut that line item next year. That's when it really hit the group who had walked away. It wasn't that the council didn't care, it was that they didn't see. They saw tasks, events, line items. They didn't see the hands that planted the seeds, the voices that encouraged shy kids, the hearts that showed up simply because they loved their home. One evening, a few of them met at the old bench near the harbor, the same spot where they used to plan the summer concert series. They didn't talk much. They just sat, watching the sun dip below the water, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. No one said, "I told you so." There was no satisfaction in being right, only a quiet sadness for the town, for themselves, for the years of invisible effort that had finally become invisible in a different way. They knew the council would eventually notice. Not because they wanted credit, but because absence has a way of making itself known. You don't miss the air until it's gone. You don't miss the quiet hum of care until the silence becomes too loud. And sure enough, the first real sign of panic came not from the council, but from the people. A mother posted in the local Facebook group, "Does anyone know what happened to the after-school program? My son keeps asking about it." Someone else replied, "I think the garden group quit. Saw the shed locked for weeks." Another comment, "Who used to organize the beach cleanups? It's getting really messy down there." The messages piled up. Not angry, not blaming, just confused and a little lost. Because for the first time in a long time, Mariner's Hollow felt like it was missing something essential. Not a building or a policy, but a feeling. A sense that someone was watching, caring, tending. The council finally took notice when attendance at their monthly meeting doubled. Residents came not to complain about potholes or zoning laws, but to ask simple, heartfelt questions. Can we bring the garden back? Is there any way to restart the youth programs? Who do we talk to about helping? That's when the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. The people who had walked away weren't just helpers. They were the heart of the town, and now that they were gone, everyone could feel the emptiness. But it was too late to just say sorry and expect things to go back to normal. Because trust, once broken, doesn't heal with words alone, and the group knew that. They'd given everything for years without asking for anything in return. Now they were giving the town something even harder to receive: silence, not as punishment, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, Mariner's Hollow was finally starting to see itself, not as it wished to be, but as it truly was. A place that had taken kindness for granted, a place that had confused quiet presence with endless availability. The storm had passed, but the real reckoning was just beginning. At first, the silence felt like a pause, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for things to go back to how they'd always been. But as days turned into weeks, that pause stretched into something heavier. The absence wasn't just missing events or empty benches. It was in the air, in the way people walked a little slower down Main Street, in the way neighbors stopped and stared a little longer at the overgrown garden behind the library. No one was angry. Not openly, anyway. But there was a quiet unease, like a song that's missing its melody. Kids who used to race to the park after school now lingered near the bus stop, unsure what to do. The elderly couple who'd picked fresh herbs from the community plot every Thursday now stood at the fence, hands in pockets, looking at the tangled rows with something like grief. Even the seagulls seemed louder without the soft chatter of volunteers tidying the beach. The town council, still operating under the belief that this was just a rough patch, tried to fill the gaps with official solutions. They assigned a staff member to oversee community engagement. They printed flyers asking for new volunteers. They even held a special meeting titled, "Rebuilding Our Community Spirit." But their efforts felt hollow, like trying to warm a house with a single match. The staff member had never met the kids in the chess club. The flyers went unnoticed on bulletin boards already crowded with lost dog posters and garage sale ads. And the meeting? Only a handful of people showed up, and most of them were just hoping to hear that the old group was coming back, because that's what everyone really wanted. Not a new plan, not a committee, just the return of the people who'd made Mariner's Hollow feel like home. But those people stayed away. Not out of spite, but because they knew something the council hadn't yet grasped. You can't replace care with paperwork. You can't schedule kindness like a city service. What they'd built wasn't a program, it was a rhythm. A quiet, steady beat that matched the pulse of the town itself. And rhythms like that can't be restarted with a memo. Meanwhile, the small things kept slipping away. The birdhouses they'd hung along the nature trail sat empty. No one remembered to clean them out in the spring. The little bench they'd painted bright blue near the lighthouse began to fade in the sun, its wood cracking from lack of oil. Even the town's unofficial welcome sign at the edge of town, which someone had always freshened up before summer visitors arrived, now looked tired and worn. People started talking, not in meetings, but in line at the grocery store, at the post office over backyard fences. Remember how they used to have lemonade for the kids during the parade? I miss seeing the garden in bloom. It made my walk feel special. Who's going to teach the new kids how to tie fishing knots like they used to? These weren't complaints. They were memories. And memories, when shared, have a way of turning into longing. The council finally began to feel the pressure, not from angry citizens, but from the quiet disappointment in people's eyes. At the monthly meeting, instead of the usual debates about streetlights and sewer lines, residents started asking simple, heartbreaking questions. Is there any way to get them back? Did we do something wrong? What can we do to help? One council member, usually focused on budgets and permits, found herself staring at an old photo on her office wall, the spring festival from 3 years ago. In it, kids were laughing under a handmade banner. Music floated from a borrowed speaker, and in the corner, barely noticeable, stood a few familiar faces setting up folding chairs. She realized she didn't even know their names. She'd seen them every year, nodded hello, maybe said thanks once or twice, but never asked how they were, what they needed, or why they kept coming back. That photo became a mirror. And what it reflected wasn't malice or neglect, but something more common and more painful, taking someone for granted. Still, the instinct was to fix, not to listen. The council approved emergency funds to revive community programs. They hired a part-time coordinator. They even ordered new garden tools and compost bins, hoping a fresh start would bring people back. But when the coordinator showed up at the garden with a clipboard and a schedule, no one came. The tools sat in the shed unused. The compost bins collected rainwater, because the problem wasn't resources. It was relationship. The truth was slowly dawning on everyone. The town hadn't just lost a group of volunteers. It had lost its keepers, the ones who noticed when a neighbor was lonely, who remembered which child was afraid of bees, who knew that the best tomatoes grew in the far left bed. These weren't tasks you could assign. They were acts of love offered freely day after day, and now in their absence the town felt thinner, like a sweater with loose threads slowly unraveling. Even the weather seemed to reflect the mood. Spring turned unusually cool and gray. Rain fell on days when the festival would have been held. Fog rolled in off the ocean and lingered, wrapping the town in a soft, sad hush. But in that quiet, something else began to stir. Not from the council, but from the people themselves. A teenager started picking up trash on the beach on his own. An older woman began leaving books in the little free library again. A few parents organized a small picnic in the park just to give their kids somewhere to play together. It wasn't the same. It wasn't enough to fill the void. But it was a start, and for the first time the town wasn't waiting for someone else to fix things. They were trying, awkwardly, imperfectly, to care for each other. The original group watched from the edges. They didn't join in, but they didn't look away either. They saw the effort. They saw the struggle, and maybe, just maybe, they saw a glimmer of hope. That the town was finally learning what they'd tried to show all along. That community isn't something you manage. It's something you tend together, but healing takes time, and trust, once broken, doesn't return with a new budget line or a well-meaning flyer. So they waited. Not to be begged back, but to see if the town would truly change, or just go back to forgetting the moment things got easier. For now, the silence remained. But in that silence, Mariner's Hollow was finally beginning to listen. By early summer, the silence had turned into something heavier, something the town could no longer ignore. It wasn't just that the garden was overgrown or the beach looked messy. It was the feeling that Mariner's Hollow had lost its warmth, like a house with the heat turned off. People still lived there, still went to work, still waved from their porches, but something essential was missing. And the ones who felt it most were the very people who'd once believed everything was fine, the town council. They'd tried quick fixes. They'd thrown money at the problem, assigned tasks, held meetings. But nothing stuck. The part-time coordinator quit after 2 months, saying, "I can't build what's already broken." The new garden tools gathered dust. The emergency fund sat untouched because no one knew how to use it without the people who'd once made everything work. The truth was sinking in, slow and uncomfortable. They hadn't just lost volunteers. They'd lost the soul of the town. The breaking point came during a routine council meeting. Someone brought up the upcoming holiday season, the one time of year when the whole town used to come together. "We should start planning the tree lighting," one member said. But then another spoke up, voice quiet but firm. "Who's going to organize it? Who's going to bake the cookies, string the lights, set up the hot cocoa stand? Last year it just happened, but this year?" They all looked at each other, and for the first time, no one had an answer. That's when the chair of the council, the same person who'd once said, "If it's so important, maybe you should fundraise yourselves," and finally broke down. Not with tears, but with honesty. "We thought it just happened," they admitted, staring at their hands. "We never asked how. We never thanked them enough. We never even asked if they were tired." The room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that's empty, but the kind that's full. Full of regret, full of realization, full of the weight of what had been lost. After that meeting, everything changed. Not overnight, but with a new kind of urgency. The council stopped treating this like a logistics problem and started treating it like a human one. They dug through old records, not for budgets, but for names. Real names of the people who'd shown up year after year. They called, not to ask for help, but to listen, and what they heard wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. It was sadness. It was, "We loved this place so much, we gave everything, and you never saw us." That stung. But it also clarified. The council held a special session, not in the usual town hall, but in the community center, the very building with the leaky roof they'd ignored. They invited anyone who wanted to come. No agenda, no speeches, just a circle of chairs and an open invitation. Tell us what we missed, and people came. Not just the original group, but parents, teens, shop owners, retirees. They spoke about the little things. How someone always remembered to save a seat for the shy kid at the summer concert. How the garden wasn't just about vegetables, but about neighbors sharing stories while pulling weeds. How the beach cleanups turned into impromptu picnics where everyone felt welcome. They weren't describing programs. They were describing care. The council listened, really listened. And for the first time, they understood. This wasn't about tasks. It was about trust. It was about respect. It was about seeing people not as free labor, but as the heart of the community still. When they reached out to the original group with apologies and promises, the response was gentle but firm. "We're not coming back to how it was." Not because they didn't care, but because they knew that if things went back to normal, the same cycle would repeat. They'd been invisible once. They wouldn't be again, so the council did something unexpected. They stepped back. Instead of trying to lead, they asked how to support. They created a new policy, not full of rules, but built on partnership. Monthly check-ins with community groups, shared decision-making on events, a small flexible fund that didn't require 10 forms to access. Most importantly, they agreed that no community project would move forward without the people who'd actually do the work having a real say. It wasn't perfect. Old habits don't vanish in a week. Some council members still slipped into fix-it mode. Some residents still expected things to magically reappear. But the tone had shifted. There was humility now. There was gratitude. And slowly, cautiously, new people began to step forward, not because they were asked, but because they finally felt seen. A retired teacher started a small reading hour at the library. A group of teens began a weekend art project on the old fence near the harbor. Someone even planted a few rows in the garden again. Not the whole thing, just enough to show it wasn't forgotten. The original group watched it all unfold from a distance. They didn't join, but they didn't turn away either. They saw the effort. They saw the change. And for the first time in months, they allowed themselves to hope. Not that they'd return, but that the town had finally learned the lesson they'd tried to teach with their silence. Because walking away wasn't about quitting. It was about making the invisible visible. And in that, they'd succeeded. The council still lamented every day in quiet ways. Not just for what was lost, but for how long it took them to see it. But that lamentation wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something better. A town that finally understood that community isn't built by policies or budgets, but by people who show up and are truly seen when they do. Months passed and Mariner's Hollow didn't magically return to what it once was, but it began to become something new, something more honest. The garden still wasn't as full as it used to be, but a few neat rows of beans and sunflowers now stood tall where weeds had taken over. The beach wasn't spotless every day, but on Saturday mornings, you'd often see a small group, sometimes teens, sometimes parents with toddlers in tow, picking up trash together, laughing as seagulls squawked overhead. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. The town council had changed too. They still met in the same wood-paneled room, but the conversations were different now. Less about control, more about connection. They stopped asking, "How do we fix this?" and started asking, "Who's already doing it and how can we help?" They learned to wait, to listen, to trust that the people who loved the town most were the ones who knew how to care for it best. The original group, the ones who'd walked away, never officially came back. But they didn't disappear either. They'd sit on benches near the harbor, watching the new reading circle gather under the oak tree. They'd nod quietly when they passed someone planting seedlings in the garden. They didn't offer advice unless asked, and even then they spoke gently, like gardeners tending a young sprout, careful not to crush it with too much attention. And slowly, the town began to understand why they'd left in the first place. It wasn't about being unappreciated in a dramatic way. It was about being unseen in the everyday way, the kind that wears you down over years. When your work becomes invisible, it starts to feel like you're invisible too, and no one can keep giving from an empty cup no matter how much they love their home. But something beautiful grew from that emptiness, because in the space they left behind, others found courage. A teenager who'd once been too shy to speak up now led a small cleanup crew. A retired mechanic started teaching kids how to fix bikes in the community center parking lot. Even the local bakery began donating leftover pastries to the new after-school hangout, just because someone mentioned kids might be hungry. No one was doing it for praise. They were doing it because they finally saw what had been missing and realized they could help fill it. In their own way, the council humbled and changed, made sure those efforts weren't swallowed by red tape. They kept the new partnership policy simple. If a group wanted to try something, the town would help with space, supplies, or just getting the word out. No endless forms, no waiting months for approval. Mistakes were allowed. Things didn't have to be perfect. What mattered was that people were showing up for each other again. One evening, as summer turned to fall, the town held a small gathering. Not a festival, not an official event, just a potluck in the park. There were no banners, no stage, no schedule. Just blankets on the grass, shared dishes, and the sound of kids chasing fireflies as the sun set. The original group came not as organizers but as neighbors. They brought a pie, sat quietly, and watched. And in that moment, something shifted, not with a bang but with a breath. The town wasn't trying to replace what was lost. It was honoring it by building something that could last, because this time it wasn't resting on the shoulders of a few quiet souls. It was shared, carried by many. The council members sat together on a bench nearby, not in suits, just in jeans and sweaters like everyone else. No one gave a speech. No one took credit. But you could see it in their eyes, the weight of regret, yes, but also a quiet pride. They'd learned a hard lesson, but they'd learned it well. And that mattered. Life in Mariner's Hollow would never be the same as before, and maybe that was okay, because before had been built on silence and sacrifice. Now was being built on respect and shared care. It was messier, slower, sometimes uncertain, but it was honest. And honesty, it turned out, was the strongest foundation of all. The original group knew they'd never get back all the years they'd given without thanks. But they didn't need to. What they needed and what they finally got was to be seen. Not as helpers, not as free labor, but as people who loved their town enough to walk away so it could learn to see them. And the town did see. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. As the fireflies blinked in the dusk and laughter floated across the grass, one of them looked around and felt something they hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because the heart of the town was beating again, not in one place, but in many. In every hand that planted a seed, every voice that said, "Let's try," every person who showed up simply because they cared. That was the real lesson, the one no policy or meeting could teach. Community isn't something you manage. It's something you nurture, together, gently every single day. And in Mariner's Hollow, that's exactly what they were learning to do.